Extension. And then I'll let Michelle and Catherine introduce themselves as well.
I'm Michelle Prosha. I'm the Ag Program Manager out of Sullivan County. And also with us today from Sullivan County is Taylor Adam, who's the beginning farmer specialist that we have. So I was thankful that she got to join us as well. Catherine?
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Brignac, and I am one of the educators over at Ulster County CCE. So I do livestock as well as natural resources and regenerative ag there. So nice to meet everyone.
So for any of you who are not familiar with what Cornell Cooperative Extension is, we're based in all counties of New York State, as well as the 5 boroughs of New York City. And so what we do is we connect our local communities with research from the College of Ag and Life Sciences, as well as the College of Human Ecology at Cornell. And we provide programming and different resources that are very tailored to our local communities. And then we also have a youth development organization that is 4-H, which is the largest youth development organization in the US. And so what we do there is we provide learning opportunities, encourage leadership roles, as well as hands-on projects in a lot of different areas to encourage youth to kind of find their passions, and empowering them to thrive and reach their fullest potential, with guidance from our awesome volunteers that serve as mentors and run programs and things like that for 4-H. So now getting into what you're all here for, we're going to go through a general overview of a lot of different topics of poultry production. And this presentation is mostly, it's really heavy on looking at chickens, just because that's kind of the most common poultry that people are raising, in their backyards or and even in commercial production. But the majority of these concepts also will apply to other poultry like ducks, geese, and a species like that. So when you're looking into raising birds, maybe not just, if you're going one step further than just kind of having them as pets, if you want them to have really a purpose on your farm or just, growing them in your yard, you're going to kind of be thinking of 2 different areas that you might want to pursue, raising birds for meat or raising birds to lay eggs. And so the meat birds are going to be faster growing birds because they are bred to be more feed efficient. Whereas the laying birds, you're going to keep them around for a while as they're getting to be adults and they're raising, are we recording? Is somebody?
Okay. Yep, I did already.
Okay, perfect, thanks. And so the layers, they're going to be around for a lot longer, producing eggs. And then, but some of the factors you can think about with those are whether you prefer like white or brown eggs, if you want eggs of different sizes based on the size of chicken. And then when looking from a production standpoint of how you want to be producing these eggs, you can look at different ways such as organic versus non-organic. Though when you're thinking about organic, that is not just a certain way that you're raising them. That's actually a USDA program that requires a certification. And so there are a lot of regulations come with that as to what you can and cannot do on your farm, such as what your chickens can be fed, what kind of like housing they need. And that's usually a several-year process that you have to go through to transition to that. And then there are also other labels such as free range or pastured poultry that can be used. And then when you think about just the commercial poultry industry, those are predominantly going to be birds raised more in indoor environments. So then to talk about, we're not going to kind of go through every single breed and a lot of different characteristics. We're just going to give you a general overview. But of course, like with dogs, a breed is just a different kind of chicken. So when you think about some of the more common or well-known varieties, you have Leghorns or Plymouth Rocks. But then within those breeds, they also have different variations, such as the Leghorns might have different shapes to their comb, the comb being, of course, that red spot on the top of their heads you can see. They also could have, them and the Plymouth Rocks could have kind of different color varieties as well within their same breed. And then you can also think about size. A lot of different breeds will also have a bantam variety. So that's going to be just the same. It's going to look the same as that breed, but in smaller. Although these are less, they're not really used in commercial production because, of course, they're going to produce less meat. They're also going to have smaller eggs. So usually those are just used for like poultry shows, or, if you just want to have interesting looking birds around your farm. And then we have the standard, which is what you would think of as a normal size chicken. That would be the predominant kind. And so here's just some examples of some different breed varieties. And you can see, if you kind of go to this website, you can also look more into the different characteristics of those breeds. But they also show, if you can look at these little insets here, the different color eggs that those birds might have, as well as what the chicks look like. And so the color of the egg is actually based, you can tell what a certain chicken will lay depending on the color of their earlobes. So if they have white earlobes, they're going to have white eggs. If they have a red or dark earlobes, they're probably going to lay brown eggs as well. So to start talking about the meat birds, some of the most common varieties are Cornish crosses. So these are birds that are bred specifically to be fast growing, very feed efficient, produce a large breast, which is, of course, the biggest cut of meat on a chicken. So they're going to be ready for processing pretty quickly at only about 7 to 9 weeks of old. And at that time, they'll be about 8 to 10 pounds. Then another common breed we have is the Freedom Rangers, or the Red Rangers. And so these birds are going to be more active, they're going to be better to have out on pasture, because they're going to be, roaming around a lot more. But of course, because of this, they're also going to be potentially slower growing, and they're going to be ready for processing at an older age, 9 to 11 weeks. And even with that longer time period, they're also going to be smaller birds. And then we also have heritage breeds. So these are the breeds that you think of as more traditional breeds or older breeds. And so these are not breeds that have been selectively bred necessarily for a particular purpose, because they're going to be used, they're dual purpose, meaning they can be used for both meat as well as eggs. So these are going to be birds that are also really good on pasture, but that does mean they're slower growing. So they're going to take, 24 weeks. So that's about 6 months or so, which is going to add to your cost as well, because if they're around for longer, they're going to eat more feed, and you're going to need to spend a lot more money to feed them. But of course, then they also can produce eggs, so you could, that could complement your meat production as well. And their meat is, sometimes people prefer them because they believe that meat is more flavorful, or they just like the idea also of, preserving more traditional breeds as well. Then moving on to the laying chickens, some of the traits that you're really looking for those is you want them to be, of course, you want them to be prolific with laying eggs. Being in New York, we want them to be able to withstand some of the cold temperatures that we have in the wintertime. And you want them to, be healthy, not get sick very easily or have a lot of issues. And then we also want them to be earlier maturing, maturing being when they're going to start laying eggs. So you want that to be earlier, so then they could be productive for a longer period of time. And then you can also, if you egg-wise, the coloration does not make a difference for like the nutritional value of the eggs, but if you have color preferences, then you can also select based on what egg color then you want to have, whether that's a white or brown. And you can see in this graphic some of the different shades of color that different breeds will often give. And there are also some that will lay a kind of a pale blue or pale green eggs as well. So here are some examples of breeds that will produce brown eggs. I think typically some of the most common ones are the Plymouth Rocks or the Rhode Island Reds. And as I said, remember the color of the earlobes here is how you're going to tell that they give brown eggs. And then there are also some hybrid breeds that can be used as egg layers. And so these hybrid breeds are basically a crossbred between two other breeds. And so because of that, they have what's called hybrid vigor in genetics. So they kind of take the best of the two breeds that compose them. And then, so they're really prolific. They produce 300 plus eggs a year, out of course, 365 days as options. And they're pretty hardy. So, very healthy birds. But with them being hybrid, if you try to breed them, then the offspring of those two is not going to have those advantages of the hybrid breed. And for the red stars here, that where it's called the sex link, that refers to the color. So when the chicks are born, there are color differences in the male and female, which is not found in most breeds of chicken. Most breeds of chickens, they have to be a little bit older than just hatched to be able to tell what sex they are. And then we have here the white layers. Probably, I'm sure the most common that people have heard of is the leghorns, and they have a couple different color patterns there. But maybe if you are looking for something with an interesting look, maybe these Polish chickens with the feathering on their heads there might be for you if you want, something interesting walking around your farm. And then, as I said, we also have some breeds here that produce colored eggs. So generally these are going to be, pale blue or pale green. If you want, something different than what you mostly see in like the grocery store or something like that. When you're thinking about where to buy, you have a couple different options. One of the more common is looking online for hatcheries. We're getting their catalog. And we're not necessarily endorsing these hatcheries listed here, but these are just a couple options that can be found in this area. There's also plenty more online, I'm sure. But you really want to make sure that you're purchasing chicks from a hatchery that's NPIP certified, which is the National Poultry Improvement Plan. And this is just a voluntary certification where they're tested for different diseases, and having that certification means that they are free of certain diseases. You don't have to worry as much about the chicks that you're getting and whether they'll have any kind of health problems. So if you're buying from a hatchery, they're going to mail you those chicks just through the post office. So you want to make sure that you're doing that at a time when you're really available to pick those packages up and then take them right home, and make sure that they have access to water, because they might be a little dehydrated after being mailed. But if you don't want to go online, if you know of a farm in your area that's selling chicks or older chickens, then you can buy from them. But you just want to do your due diligence and ask what kind of if they've been tested or if they have any health problems, typically, to ensure that you're going to be getting healthy birds. And then, as I'm sure any of you who have gone into a Tractor Supply or other feed stores, they also have chicks or like baby ducks as well in the springtime. So then you can pick them up and get all your supplies there and take them home right that day. But either way, whether you're going for meat birds or egg layers, you want to just make sure that the birds you're getting are going to fit what you want to do with them. So whether you're getting certain breeds, or if you want chickens that just have a really interesting look to them, you might want to take that into account. And then you also want to make sure that the birds you're getting look and act like they're supposed to. So they're healthy, they're roaming around, they're scratching and pecking, you're making sure that they're eating and drinking and nothing's wrong with them. They're not being really lethargic and things like that. So then when you buy from a hatchery, there are a couple different options you have for selection. And just as a note, of course, you don't need a rooster for the chickens that you have to lay eggs. The only reason you would need a rooster is if you then wanted to breed chickens and then have your hens hatch their own eggs and raise baby chicks and such. But if you are looking to buy a straight run, it means that the hatchery or farmer, wherever you're getting them, hasn't taken the time to evaluate every chick and see whether it's male or female. They just kind of, grab a certain number of chicks and you get what you get. And then as they get older, you can then see, how many hens, how many roosters you might have gotten. You can also purchase sexed chickens that they did, take that time to sort out the females from the males. And those probably are going to be a little more expensive just because of the added labor that's involved with those. If you don't want to get baby chicks, you can also get pullets, which are hens that are under a year old. So then they're kind of in that teenage stage there where they're not quite adults and laying eggs yet, but they are a little bit older. And then if you are interested in getting male birds, if you want to get a rooster like breeder chickens or something like that, there is that option as well. You also could buy fertilized eggs and put them in an incubator, and then you can raise them yourself. And so this is, it's going to add time and take a little longer if you want that, but then you also know, right from the start how they've been cared for and things like that. Here's the incubation duration of some of the different species that you might want to be interested in. The chickens really are one of the shorter ones, but if you want ducks or if you want to raise turkeys, that's going to be a little bit longer of an incubation time. And of course, if you really want to get crazy and get an emu, they're going to take about a month and a half or so to incubate those eggs. So when you start off with brooding chicks, you're going to, of course, they need to be kept warm. So you're going to want to keep them at 90 to 92 degrees. And then as they get older, with each week, you can reduce that then by about 5 degrees each week until you kind of come to that room temperature of 70 degrees. As you can see in this picture, here's a picture of a brooder box, and you'll notice that it has a mesh wire over top of it. And so this is really important to secure this heat lamp and make sure that it's not going to be able to fall into this, for one, because of course you don't want it falling on any of your chicks and injuring them. And for two, you also don't want it falling into this nice bedding here and catching on fire, because that could be a huge problem. If somebody's not around and that happens, or if like the glass in here breaks, you don't want that. You don't want falling and breaking the bulb or anything. And if you have a really large area, you're also going to want a brooder guard, which is just, it can be like plastic, it could be wood or cardboard or something like that, just to keep the chicks in a smaller area when they're really young. And of course, you want them to immediately have access to feed and water, and you want that available at all times, so they can eat and drink when they want. So here are some ideas for layouts for the brooder. You have kind of here where the heat lamp is, in the circle there, and you have feeders and water scattered about. If you have kind of a larger feeder, maybe you don't need like several of them, but you want to make sure that there's plenty enough room for all of the chicks to have access of whenever they want it. And then you see here is the brooder guard that I was talking about, kind of keeping them confined in this smaller area here. And then, different layouts like that. And so here's some also, you see these just have, a couple groups in a smaller cardboard box. And here, and the top one here, you can see this is probably, on a farm, so they probably have a lot more chicks that they're raising, so they have this larger area. But you can see here are the feeders, here are the waters, here's the heat lamp, so whenever they need to get under it, they can. But with this one here, as I said, you want to be careful that these heat lamps are secured. So this kind of looks like it's, kind of inside the box, and you maybe want to stay away from that. You want to make sure that's a lot more secure. And here's just another couple examples. See here, a box made of wood. It looks like they're probably inside, so they have this tarp to protect their floors. Or here you have the brooder guard here, keeping them in this small space that's in what looks like a shed. And so they have access to all the feed and water from inside this box, or they can go outside if they want to. And then as they get older, you can also allow them some outdoor access as well, while still making sure that you see the hovering heat lamp here, so they're still able to regulate their temperature as they want to. You can see lots of fans for ventilation here. But you want to make sure that their temperature is regulated well. You want them to be able to move freely about as they need to. And so when the temperature is just right, you can see that they're pretty evenly distributed. But in this graphic over here, where the heat lamp is right here, they're too hot, they're staying as far away as possible to try and, you know, get to a cooler area. And then if you look at the bottom here, this is obviously this environment is too cold because they're all huddled up under the heat lamp. And you really want to avoid that, for one, because if they are all huddling up, you don't want them climbing over the top of each other and potentially injuring each other as well. And you also want to avoid drafts, of course. And you can see this graphic here depicts that maybe there's a draft moving in through here, so they're all huddled away trying to get away from that. And they don't feel like they can move as freely about to, you know, get food or water, because they're just trying to stay warm and away from the draft there. When we think about nutrients that are required for whether that's chickens, ducks, or any other animal, water doesn't always come to mind, but water is so critically important for, you know, maintain body temperature, for all of the, you know, essential processes, you know, with organs and things like that. So you need to make sure that birds have access to clean water at all times. And, you know, you don't, it's helpful sometimes if you want to raise it off the floor a little bit so they can't be walking all over it, because you don't want them, you know, walking in it, getting feed in it, getting their bedding, or sometimes even pooping in it. So you want to make sure that, you know, when you are checking on the chickens, you want to make sure that all the water is clean. And then potentially if you are maybe, your chickens might be having some health problems or something, maybe you can think about adding like vitamins or electrolytes in the water, which also could be helpful in getting them off to a good start. So here are some of the just basic equipment that you need. Of course, as we talked about, having feeders and waterers, and depending on your setup, like you might need heat lamps if you're raising chicks, or maybe sometimes if it's getting really cold in the winter, you might think about that even for if it's like really, really cold, even for older chickens. You might think about fences if you have an outdoor setup as well. And then if you are wanting laying hens, you definitely need nesting boxes. And here's an example of a nesting box that you could buy like a Tractor Supply or something, but it doesn't really need to be anything fancy. You could even make that yourself if you are, you know, handy with tools. And you want, for the nesting boxes, you want at least one box for every 4 birds that you have. And then you want to fill them with some kind of bedding like straw or shavings or sawdust, something that's soft, so when they lay eggs, they're not going to crack. And they have, you know, just a soft place to be. Other than having the bedding in there, and other ways to avoid losing eggs or having broken eggs is to have those nests above floor level. My roommate and I, we had a few chickens, and we just had a shed in the backyard that had a shelf on it. So we put their nesting boxes up on the shelf, and that, you know, kept it off the floor, away from anything that might step on it, or potentially predators or something like that. And of course, as I said, you want to make sure you have enough nests for all the chickens. And collecting eggs regularly also will prevent them from being damaged. And you can also, you know, it doesn't need to necessarily look like this. It doesn't have to really be anything fancy, but if you have like even, you know, shoe boxes or something like that, you know, you just need a space where they can go and lay eggs and stuff like that. So then to look at specifically, you know, more of the details for if you're having laying hens. So here are some examples of housing, different types of housing. And, you know, it doesn't need to be anything fancy. You know, as you see in the top corner there, somebody had a, you know, old rusted out car that they, you know, put some fencing in, some wire there. Or if you already have a shed in your backyard or something like that, feel free to use those, because they don't, as long as their basic needs are met, they don't really need, you know, anything like super fancy. But you do want to make sure that the space is clean, dry, and there's not any drafts, but you also want it to be well ventilated. And you have options of whether you want it to be a permanent structure, or if you want to be able to have them on a pasture and be able to move them around. But whether you do permanent or mobile, they do have certain space requirements for birds in general. So you want 2 square feet of space inside for the birds, and then 4 square feet in their run. So the run being like kind of the outside area if you have that. And then when you have laying birds, you're also going to want to have roosting perches also in whatever structure you have. And then you need to allow 8 inches of space for each bird on that, so they can all have space at the same time. And of course, as I said, making sure there's enough space for all of the hens to be able to get to the feed and water as well. And then also, if you do are allowing your chickens to go outside, it's often very helpful to have a fenced-in space for them. For one, it could help protect them from predators. And also because chickens, if they are not fenced in, they will go wherever they want to go, even if you don't want them to go there necessarily. So kind of prevent them from wandering off to maybe your neighbors wouldn't appreciate your chickens coming around. You might want to keep them fenced in. And so, of course, with airflow that I mentioned, you want it to be well ventilated, but also not drafty. So kind of the way to think about that is you don't want the air coming in to be blowing directly on the chickens, where they're on their roosting perches, or if when they're on the floor near the food and water. So you want the ventilation to kind of be in areas that's not going to be blowing directly on them, maybe having a fan at the top, or having some like openings in the roof to allow that fresh air in. However you have it ventilated, you also want to make sure that weather's not going to get in, there's not rain that's going to get in, because you want to keep them dry, as well as keeping the floor dry. You don't want, making a huge mess with feed and things like that, and flooding or anything. But then also, it's if you want to outdoor access, that can be good for the chickens. They can express those natural behaviors, such as, foraging for like bugs or ticks and things like that. Scratching at the ground, and then picking those bugs that they get. They'll also, if they're outside, they'll find places to have dust baths. And that it can also be, having all that space and sunlight and fresh air can be really helpful to promote health in the chickens. But of course, if they're outside, they also can be exposed to other birds or other animals, particularly wild birds that could spread diseases. So you also have to be thinking about ways to limit the interaction between wild birds and your chickens if you want to keep your chickens healthy. And so when you're thinking about chickens having outdoor space, you might be thinking about calling them free range, but the official USDA definition for free range is very vague. So the requirement is just that they are allowed access to the outside. So as both a producer and consumer, you want to be thinking about those things, because it gives producers a lot of leeway to be able to use that label. So if you have chickens outside, you can use that label, but as a consumer, you don't necessarily know what that outside space really looks like. But there's different ways that you can have those spaces, even allowing them outside. Here on these pictures, there's a fixed house with the yard. So you can see it's a non-mobile structure, and they just have kind of a single space that they're allowed outside. And that's, it's not being exposed to like new areas and stuff like that. But then you can also do portable structures. So here you see that these little like, as the captain's saying, eggmobile, but they look like little sheds around wheels that can be moved like a 4-wheeler, if you have a tractor to haul around to different spots. And so then they can allow the chickens access to different areas, to be able to wander more, and then they can be shut up again at night to keep them safe from predators and things like that. And they're going to lay their eggs in here as well. And so if you're doing portable, you also want to think about how it can affect the land that you are moving the houses on. You can see here, this house is not moved very frequently. So you see they've kind of torn up the grass here, and it's just dirt around there. But in this one that's moved frequently, that's really spread around how they move, or like where they're dropping manure and stuff like that. So once they're kind of moved out of this area, it would be a lot easier for the grass to come back here than it would in this dirt patch right here. So you also want to think about taking care of the land as well when you are moving your chickens around. And also with fencing, Electronet also is a really helpful tool. I'm using it for portable fencing that will be a little bit more of a deterrent for keeping your chickens in, as well as keeping predators out as well. And if you have kind of this not moving structure like a barn or a shed, you can have the fence be plugged in. But then if you can also get solar powered chargers for these, so then it could still be in a portable system as well. And so, as I said, you know, the chickens, they don't need anything fancy. You see, obviously these ones, not anything fancy with the toilet seats there, but, you know, just putting some wood, you know, making their own box in the wall. Here they have some buckets or like plastic tubs. So they don't need to be a fancy space as long as they have the space, and they, you know, put bedding in like shavings or straw, shredded paper. If you have like artificial turf, that can be options as well. Just something that's soft that is going to prevent the eggs from being broken. So then, Michelle, you want to take over here then?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just go ahead and tell you next slide. I've got a couple to go through here. So, you know, just continuing on with some of the housing here, you know, housing for meat layers, or, you know, not meat layers, meat birds and egg layers isn't too different, you know, except that there just needs to be some kind of nesting box for, you know, the eggs. But, you know, same goes here with the space requirements for meat birds, you know, 2 square feet per bird, 4 square feet per run. Ideally, obviously, adequate space for food and water. And because these are meat birds, you don't have to go ahead and have any perches or nesting boxes, you know, because they're not going to be roosting. They're more or less going to be, you know, foraging or just eating all your feed out of the feeders there. Go ahead. So I just threw, there's a bunch of pictures because I'm a visual learner, so I like to see different pictures, and then you guys can decide, you know, what works best for you. But these are just some movable structures. I think I have in the future here some of the pictures from kind of a Joel Saladin poultry operation. If you've ever heard of that fella, he's got a bunch of great books as well. But these are just movable pen structures. And I can tell you from experience to make sure that you, whatever you're building, make sure that it's you're able to move it yourself, you know, unless you need to move it with, say, a tractor or a ATV or anything like that, because these things can get kind of heavy. So when you got to move a lot of structures around the field, it's just easier and nicer if they're, you know, a little bit lighter, maybe made with PVC instead of all these hardwoods here. But you know, it's just something that you learn as you go, and I learned not to build them so heavy eventually. Next. So there are options, obviously, for outdoor pasture structures here. You can have something with skids. You can have them with floors, no floors, whatever you like. You know, and if you're going to be moving them around the pasture, you know, just depending on how well you want the chickens to disturb up the earth there, that depends on what you would like to use, floor or no floor. Go ahead, next. They have some of these as well. They're just different options, like I said, to show you what you can use, but just make sure that however many birds you have total, you can do that calculation to make sure they have adequate floor space. And, you know, during the height of their, you know, the height of the summer, or as they're older, you're going to want to move them more frequently so they have access to kind of fresh pasture too. And that helps save your pasture from getting dug up too. Next. Again, just a couple more. Of course, I had to throw in one of my favorite slides, or my pictures. But one thing here at the bottom, just to note that we're always, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but we're always trying to keep predators out, and predators could be anything that's trying to get your chickens. So just keep in mind for you know, your pets that you have, if they're going to be around chickens, just to make sure that they don't have access to them. So here on the bottom, these are the Joel Saladin structures. They're it's just a movable pen option here that has enough adequate space for the amount of birds that they're going to have. Pros and cons of these, you know, it depends on you guys, what you guys see as pros and cons, but what I noticed is kind of these portable pasture or movable pasture pens. They can be very labor intensive. Obviously, you'll be having to move them daily, if not twice a day, by hand. And, you know, they are out in the field. So even though there is, you know, shade structure, they're still open to the elements as well. So you know how crazy of weather we can get no matter what the season. However, pros on it are that they are flexible as far as being where you can put them, generally low cost, as opposed to say a shed or a non-movable structure. They're really good for beginners, and of course, perfect for waste management, right? Because you go ahead and just move the chickens through the pasture and just leave the waste where it is, and it gets absorbed into the ground as you go. As opposed to our stationary pasture pens, you know, these also have some pros and cons. And generally, they're a little bit more labor intensive to clean because, you know, you're not able to move anything. So to keep your birds healthy and, you know, that free of ammonia smell when you walk into their pen or their shed or barn or wherever they are, you know, you're going to have to clean it out more frequently than being able to just have the waste be there in the ground. Depending on how much space you have, there generally is less pasture because you kind of have a more fenced in area. And because these chickens don't get to move around, you often have more mud and dirt in the same area. Obviously, pros for these kind of stationary pens are that they're usually a little bit, I'll say this blanketly, but it's not always the case, but it can provide good protection from predators and often better at elements, but you know how predators are, they can get it anywhere. But as opposed to, you know, outdoor or pasture pens, they usually provide better. You don't have to move them, which is nice if you don't have that option. And if you're able to use kind of an existing structure on your property or recycle something like that, it can be less costly than having to build additional pens. Go ahead. Yep, this one has a couple of slides here. So as we're talking about the different types of, you know, feeding and nutrition things, this is kind of like the 1,000-yard view. Obviously, any of these topics that we talk about today can be individual classes. You know, it can go on for you know, forever, and we can delve deeper into it. But I am going to go into the different, you know, nutrition and feeding amounts here. But as Grace said earlier, you know, the same with water. Feed is also very important for animals. And the idea of keeping it fresh, not having moldy food or contaminated feed is really important. You know, you want to make sure that the feed that you're feeding, you know, is free of any of that mold or contamination, which, you know, if you have the opportunity to buy in bulk, just making sure that the animals are able to eat through it before it goes moldy. Yeah, go ahead to the next slide. I'll keep talking. Yep. So one thing that, you know, we talk about is what is in a feed. So basically, it's got a lot of different ingredients and nutrients, but what you're looking for when you're going to the store here, or any of the you know, truck supply, feed stores, anything like that, is you're looking at the protein percentage based on what age your animals are, your layers are. So for pullets, broilers, layers, chicks, they all have different types of feed and protein requirements. So what you're going to be doing is when you're going to the store, checking on the label to make sure that you're purchasing for the age of the bird that you have. A lot of people call in, I don't know about YouTube, Grace or Catherine or even Taylor, but we get a lot of calls about people wanting to kind of do their own feed where they want to mix it themselves. And really, it's difficult to provide a full nutritional experience, I'll call it experience for that animal, unless you're a nutritionist. So you can go ahead and supplement in small amounts with feed waste from your own what you eat, but ideally nutritional balanced feed is what the animals need. So go ahead. So for feeding animals, as Grace mentioned before, but generally the amount of birds that you have, they need about 4 inches of feeder space per bird as they're older. When you're thinking about raising from chicks on up, you want to just make sure that the height of the feeder is like they're able to access it. So, as they're chicks, it'll be lower to the ground. And then as the birds get older, you can raise it up higher off the ground, which is nice too, because birds are inherently messy and you want to be able to go ahead and try to prevent them from getting their feeders all messy. So, and the same with waterers, you can raise them up too, so they don't poop in them, which is helpful to keep bacteria down and things like that. And just as a note before we go to the next slide, if you are pasture raising your poultry or having your birds out on pasture to have access to it, they still need poultry feed. They can't survive solely on, what is found out in a pasture. Okay, so here are some of the feeding schedules depending on your birds. For meat production birds here, so those Cornish crosses that we have, I did 3 different ones here. I did Cornish cross, the Freedom Ranger, which is the slower growing, and the dual purpose birds, which can be used as either meat or egg laying. So for Cornish crosses, your feed schedule from age, week 1 to 3 of their life is that they need about 20 to 22% chick starter, and that's the amount of feed that they're, or the amount of protein that they're getting and that you're purchasing from. And then after that, you can move them down in protein, because when you're thinking protein, the higher the protein, the more expensive the feed would be. So protein equals money. So if you are able to decrease the amount of protein, then you are able to save some money if you're doing this more for production sense too. So weeks 3 through 9, or up to 9, you can bump it down to 18 to 19% grower feed until processing. Now for Cornish crosses, good rule of thumb is that because they have been bred to grow so quickly, something that producers do is they feed or allow access to feed for 12 hours of the day, and then they remove the feed the following 12 hours. And usually that's at 3 weeks of age and up. And that allows them to not overfeed and potentially, have heart issues or anything like that. And in addition, like just as people, we can only eat so many calories in a day without the additional calories turning into fat. So we only want to produce muscle in these birds, because muscle is where the meat is, where it's you charge by the pound for if you're doing this for meat production. So there's only so much of a caloric intake that a bird can have before it starts producing fat, which is not money. No money in fat, right? So so just keep an eye on Cornish crosses, because they have a little bit of a little specialty because they grow so fast. However, Freedom Rangers, they do not have to do this 12 hours on, 12 hours off thing for health, because they are slower growing, so they don't have that that issue. So week 1 through 3 from them, you do 21 to 22% protein, chick starter. Week 4 through 7, 18 to 19% grower, and then finishing up with weeks 8 through 11, you can bump them down to 16 to 17% grower, because you can save some money that way. And you can see here for dual purpose breeds, you know, they have layer. You can check and see if the layer feed that you get at the store protein. I'm excited too, talking about feed. And you know, but generally the game bird ration for dual purpose has a higher protein percentage, and then you can bump it down. Next slide, please. So predators, I know I touched on this a bunch, but this is going to be one of your number one issues. You know, and it's hard. I've done a whole class on all the different predators and what it looks like, and animal droppings, animal footprints, you know, what it looks like when they attack. You know, different animals do different things to chickens. But, you know, generally it's the usual suspects: dogs, cats, raccoons, you know, you name it. If it's got a beak or claws, or it's hungry, it's going after your chicken. So you want to be able to make sure that you do your best due diligence on trying to go ahead and prevent predators coming in. One good thing is, when you are building your chicken coop, or say you have a non-mobile structure, is to bury your fencing, you know, 6 inches to a foot down, to prevent any animals from burrowing underneath. You can set traps if you like. There's always guard dogs, but you know, you're just going to try your best on how to predator proof your poultry area. And nature has a funny way of letting you know when you didn't do a good job, or you have a little area that might need a little more predator proofing. So, you know, it happens, unfortunately. So we just are going to do our best and try. Next slide. I think there's a couple bubbles on these. So with poultry or any livestock, there's also going to be the inevitable waste or feces and pests that can come with it. So, you know, one hen is going to produce about half a pound of poop a week, or 2 cubic feet per year. That's for one. So you just make sure that you either have a good area that you can either compost the waste, or you have an option to get rid of it somehow. If you compost it, it does keep the smell down. It does keep pests away, because the pile itself will heat up and inevitably not smell. Because poultry manure is so high in fertilizer content, just be careful if you're using it for anything, you know, in your garden. Also, if you are spreading it for fertilizer, make sure that you're doing it at least 90 to 120 days prior to harvest for anything for vegetables. In addition, you're welcome to give it away to neighbors, anything like that. And with composting or properly managing your waste, you're able to control the fly population and not allow critters to have an opportunity to come and visit your either where you have feed, or anything like that. So metal containers are nice to contain feed. That way it keeps out the weather, keeps out pests, keeps out mice and rats and things like that. Next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to get into too much you can go ahead, on reproduction and production, but I just wanted to give a few definitions more or less, just so you're aware if you're going to be purchasing, especially from stores, they just have different terminology for different ages of animals. So cockerels and pullets can become sexually mature by ages 14 to 16 weeks of age. So that means that if you have, say, a straight run, remember male and female mixed together, that if you don't want fertilized eggs, make sure that you will be separating your animals, males and females, by 14 to 16 weeks of age. So, for those who don't care about fertilized eggs, or if you're selling to the public and you don't want to have any blood spots or missed fertilized eggs in that sense, you can always separate. In general, our poultry industry delays sexual maturation from around 18 to 25 weeks, which helps these birds get bigger, and which will result in better egg size, because industry wants everything the same, right? They don't want, if you had chickens, how sometimes when they first start laying, they come out small or misshapen. Well, for, big poultry operations, a standard laying hen and standard eggs are what they're looking for. So just as some insight. For those who are trying to have more or less year-round egg production, as we see this time of year that there is more light during the day, it's not dark at 5 o'clock anymore. So reproduction occurs with light stimulation, and based on the amount of hours, whether it's natural sunlight or, even using something as like a light or a bulb in the barn, you can trick the bird into producing eggs longer. So if that's something that you don't want to do or don't need to do, you don't have to. But if you're looking at this in more or less like a business standpoint, you can increase and stimulate reproduction or egg laying for birds by having at least 14 hours of light in your barn or in your structure during the day. Go ahead. So as Grace mentioned earlier, pullets are females under a year old. And generally when they start laying their eggs, most breeds around 5 to 7 months. And what happens is with poultry, if you ever heard of a bell curve, where it starts off there and it peaks and it comes back down. So if you're doing this for strictly production standpoint, your best egg years are around age 1 to 2. After that, that bell curve starts dipping down. So if you are trying to maintain a certain amount of eggs per day or year or whatever for either your customers or yourself or your family, you're going to want to have to introduce or add some replacement pullets or chicks to your operation to maintain that amount, because inevitably, the girls will get a little tired and their egg production will dip down a bit. If you're having trouble teaching chickens where to lay eggs, because, after all, I would want to lay where that toilet seat would be, that that one of those options that we have, those are pretty cool. Everybody's, you work really hard, you got it going on in the barn, and then they decide to lay on the floor. Well, chickens, they're special creatures, but they still need to be taught. So sometimes you can add, say, a golf ball, or you can purchase a fake egg as well, or whatever you want to do to help try and teach them to nest into the nesting box or wherever you're trying to have them nest, and not on the floor, because on the floor is where there's feces and poop and predators, mice, you know, you name it. So ideally, we would all love if they would just lay their eggs in a nesting box, but easier said than done sometimes. So go ahead to next slide. So depending on what you want to do, I do like to give this disclaimer on folks when they're trying to figure out how many birds they want to buy. Each full-grown hen will lay about 200 to 300 eggs per year. So, you know, if you have 12 birds, that's generally a dozen eggs a day. So either you're making a lot of frittatas, or you know, you have some customers. So just keep that in mind when you have the amount of birds on your mind that you want to buy, because they're going to lay every day, more or less, you know, based on sunlight. But you know, just have a plan for what to do with those eggs. So like I said, winter, they can slow down a little bit. And at some point, the girls will need a break, and they go through something called a molt. So they look a little rough during this time. Their egg production is going to go down. Their feathers, you know, are going to not look so hot anymore. But it's natural. So they're just going to, you know, take the break that they need and go ahead and regrow them. Go ahead. So I added this slide in because I wanted to just make sure that everyone is aware. So this is a kind of a hot topic. Well, honestly, since 2014, 2015, when we've had the highly pathogenic avian flu came into our country, and it has caused over 50 million bird deaths throughout the United States. And actually that's up to, I looked today, that's up to 58 million birds. So this is something that us as extension educators, we have worked really, really hard to try and go ahead and just let all bird producers become aware, no matter what the size. Obviously, some of the larger poultry farms have more intense biosecurity measures to prevent the spread of disease into their facilities. But, you know, smaller producers or backyard producers often don't have as good biosecurity. You know, they might wear the same boots that they went out and fed their chickens in the morning, and then they went to Tractor Supply, and, you know, could potentially spread disease that way. So just things that are preventable as far as spreading disease has a lot to do with good biosecurity measures. So just a good idea to keep the boots on the barn that you are using on the barn or on your farm, and then, you know, change into something else anytime you go. But I digress. Back to the avian flu here. So I just looked, and it is it's a poultry virus that came in about 2015. We had another big surge kind of right around the pandemic time as well, and it just hasn't let up quite yet. And I looked on the USDA APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service website. This is where anybody can go look and see where the latest avian flu has popped up in our state. And in November of last year, we had some in Sullivan County, and just as recently as this past week or end of April, there was a case out in Putnam County, which isn't too far from us. So the way that this virus spreads is through waterfowl or wild birds from migratory patterns. So our neck of the woods is a prime migratory pattern from Canada down to the south. So, you know, it's problematic for our region, but, you know, you're seeing it across all of the United States. So what happens is the waterfowl themselves have what they call a low pathogenic strain of the virus. So they are able to carry it. And then you can go to the next slide, please. They're able to carry it and it sheds in their feces. And so they are carriers, but they do not die from it. And then it sheds through their feces there, and then our birds get it. So unfortunately, the highly pathogenic avian flu is very deadly to poultry, non-waterfowl species. So you know, it's pretty rough. So we're doing our best that we can to let folks know about it, and to make sure that you're aware. We'll go one more slide for me. So if you are start seeing sudden death of your birds on your farm, you can go ahead and give, you know, any one of us a call, and we can kind of walk you through what, you know, the process is to make sure that you don't have avian flu on your property. But really what you're seeing is sudden death. You know, it's a respiratory disease. So you're going to have lack of oxygen, purple discoloration of the wattles, combs, nasal discharge, coughing, sneezing. But more often than not, before you notice anything, there's a high level of mortality with them. So, but yeah. So, but the problem is that, you know, there's not much prevention. There's no vaccine. There's no way to prevent it except for biosecurity measures. You know, if you're seeing a lot of issues within our county, you know, we might recommend trying to keep poultry indoors, to have them not have access to wild birds, wild waterfowl, you know, and then birds obviously that are, I think I saw a chat here. Yeah, we're, you know, if there's open water sources, that's also a chance for migratory waterfowl to come through. So yeah, just be aware of what you got going on your property. Next, please. So beyond avian flu, you know, there's other things that you can be aware of, but planning is probably your best bet to be prepared for having chicks come into your property. So if you need, if you had chicks prior, you know, disinfecting the area to make sure there's no disease that can be transmitted from your old birds to your new birds. Anything that can control coccidiosis or, you know, diarrhea in any of your birds. You could add a coccidiostat or vinegar to the water. Things like preventing feather pecking and cannibalism, which can be caused by kind of overcrowding or improper ventilation. I know we talked about that before. Planning for parasites, if you might need any commercial dusting or diatomaceous earth, and of course biosecurity. So shoes and boots for farm only, please. And of course, if you wanted to go ahead and talk to your vet ahead of time, if you have a relationship with a vet and want to let them know if you're getting a substantial amount of chickens, or if they have any suggestions for you with buying your birds or where to buy your birds. And if you are doing any sort of processing of your birds, like you're going to use them for meat, I highly recommend talking to your processor ahead of time, or the facility that you're going to use, to make sure that you have space, they have space available to process your birds, because things can be booked up for a while. So you want to make sure that you don't, you know, you aren't just holding your birds ahead of time. Money. All right, so this just gives you an overview of what feed costs are. Again, I think when I looked, the numbers that I have might have been a little bit pre-pandemic numbers, but the math is easy enough that we can you can adjust for today's prices or wherever you're buying, because not everybody buys the same place. But just to give you an idea, a chick is going to eat roughly 9 to 10 pounds of feed in its first 10 weeks, or about 8 to 9 pounds in the first 6 weeks for broilers. So your mature standard size chicken is going to eat about 5 pounds of feed per month if they're allowed to free range, a little bit more if they're, cooped up. They'll do about 6 pounds a month. So based on how many birds that you have, that's how much feed you will need per bird. Next, please. So again, this $14 here, this is just an example I use, but it's a little, I know that's a little bit more money now, but the math is still there. So for those 16 layer crumbles or 16% layer crumbles that hypothetically I purchased at Tractor Supply for $14, that chicken will eat about 1/4 pound a day, and I'll show you a chart in a little bit. That means I'm going to spend about 50 cents of feed per week for one bird. So what I talked about earlier, with a bird can only eat so much feed, without producing fat. So that's why overfull feeders can lead to extra cost. Go ahead. So here's a nice chart that I pulled from one of the hatcheries for Cornish crosses that just kind of shows you how much feed they eat per week and how many pounds they'd gain as well. So for example, in this 20% feed, which is about $18 a bag in my example, you have $18 with a 50-pound bag of feed, which means each pound of feed in that $18 bag was about 36 cents. And by the time that these birds got up to 8 weeks, I fed them about 13.43 pounds, which means at this time of this example, it cost me about $4.83 per bird to raise. So that doesn't include anything else that I purchased for the bird or processing costs or anything like that, but strictly for feed, based on this example, it was about $4.83. All right, so I like to talk about record keeping because I think it keeps us all on track as far as knowing where we can potentially either save ourselves some money or have a better idea of how to plan better for the following year, or you name it. But also for record keeping, there's a bunch of different functions that you can do. Tax purchases, if this is going to be your business and you're filing your Schedule F for farming on your taxes for farm income, you need to know some kind of or have some kind of record keeping for that. If you're looking to obtain credit or funding, these numbers are always important too. There's financial and production records, how many birds you produced, how many eggs you produced or sold, or how much meat you got out of it all. And if you're selling birds as well, it just helps identify where these birds come from or where you purchase birds as well, just in case there's something that could be wrong, like a disease, you'd know where it came from. So for production records, these are just kind of like some examples of some of the production records that I kept when I raised poultry. And it was age and number of birds. So I would make sure that I would be feeding the appropriate protein percentage, the number of eggs, mortality, livability, how many died, how many lived, live weight, dressed weight, which is after the animal has been processed, I added temperature in here, and I'll tell you why. Because when I first started raising birds for a farmer's market, we would purchase them February, March, where obviously our February, March can be a range of things. It can be hot, it can be cold. So it would help me identify when I would have high mortality. I like to match it up with the temperature that from that day to see if it was something I could have prevented. If I knew that it was going to be really cold that day, I could have added an extra heat lamp, or too hot that day, I could have raised the heat lamp so it wasn't as hot in there. Just different things just help me make better decisions as we went along. And then of course, any medications or vaccinations that we added in inventory of for meat or eggs. Next. Financial records. Again, if you're selling, you got to know how much you sold. But I would also keep count of all the purchases I made for feed or expenditures, like processing, labor, equipment, anything else that would come into play. Because if you're doing kind of like a business plan for your poultry operation, these are all good things to know about. Feeding records, price per bag, number of bags purchased. And then I made sure to note, because I did, Cornish crosses, mainly, that I would just identify when I did the 12 hours on, 12 hours off for those. So some questions to ask yourself before buying birds here. What production system am I going in? Am I going meat production, layer production, something in the middle, dual purpose? How many do I want? Again, remember that those birds can, layers, for example, can have up to 300 eggs per day or per year. Oof. Depending on how many birds you got, that's something, right? But, just knowing that you have outlets for the products that are going to be produced. Something that's really important is, how many birds can my property hold? Am I allowed to have birds on my property? So before you go ahead and purchase birds, it's really good to check with your town code to make sure that you're able to have birds on your property in the first place, if you're allowed to have roosters, and how many are you allowed to hold? And then if you have any equipment needs, is this something that you need to purchase ahead of time, or can you do with what you have on your property already? So for my budget for meat production, and it's pretty similar for layer production. I forget if I have a slide next or not, but your budget is going to include these things, or anything else that you want to add to it is too. This is not all inclusive. Chicks, feeders, waterers, brooders, chicken tractor, poultry crates. These are if you're going to be moving chickens for processing, you need to have something to put them in to get them to the processor. If you're not doing it on your own property, a freezer. If you're doing this outside, electric fencing or charger, and include your processing fee for your budget. Egg production, pretty much similar, except freezer, you might have a refrigerator. You'll have to add egg cartons, different things like that. So, but mainly most of the same line items for each budget. Okay, processing. So I'm not going to go into, the steps for processing. That's a whole nother day. But just to give you an idea, there are different types of processing. So you have your mobile processing units, or these are fewer and far between. I don't know about you guys, anybody else, but in our region, I don't know of any mobile processing units, but they would have been nice. But anyway, so what we have is we have state inspected plants, federally inspected plants, and we have the option for processing on our own property under the 1,000 bird exemption, and that's only in New York State. And that is that you are able to slaughter up to 1,000 birds or 250 turkeys on your own property without going through any kind of licensing. So here's a nice little chart from the USDA, but it just gives you the different certifications that they have available. So we have the 1,000 bird limit, then the next registration or certification for that would be the 20,000 bird, and it goes up from there. So depending, if you're looking to get into poultry processing and have questions about which one you might fall under, you can contact any one of us here, and we'd be happy to let you know where you can sell them and where you can't sell them. So that was meat. So eggs, eggs is generally a little easier here, but what's something that is I like to harp on is that quality begins in the barn. So, making sure that the barn itself or the nesting boxes, the bedding is clean and you're able to collect eggs frequently. There's no, set rule that says you must collect eggs X amount of times per day, but just keep in mind that, as things get colder or hotter, egg quality can be reduced. So, in the summer, you might have to collect them, twice a day, same for the winter, to make sure that they're not freezing or spoiling in that sense. So, but it's always good to go check on your girls anyway. One thing that I like to know is that the bucket or container that you're collecting the eggs, just make sure it's clean and get rid of any dirty or cracked or misshapen eggs that you have. Next, please. So I know this is a conversation I have a lot of times in the year, but it's the old, adage about, keeping eggs not in a refrigerator. They just put them on the counter, they're fine. What I'll say is that USDA standards or food safety standards, especially if you're going to be selling these eggs to the public, you have to conform by regular food safety standards, just like the supermarket. So that means that eggs should be placed in a cooler or refrigerator immediately after gathering and maintained at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what I'll say on that one. What you want to do with your own eggs, that's fine. But if you're giving them to the public or your neighbor or anything like that, they must be maintained at 45 degrees. Now, if you are putting them in your own refrigerator, that's fine too, but just be aware that eggs by nature are porous. So for example, if you have, onions in your fridge for whatever reason, or some kind of strong odored food, that odor might absorb into the eggs, and you'll be wondering why your non-onion omelet tastes like onions, so they can go ahead and absorb. So, and just be aware that if you have a rooster on your property, and the eggs may be fertile, the higher the temperature, you could have embryos start to develop. So if you are selling to the public, it's always a good idea, if you have a rooster, to just candle, or, you can candle or, put a flashlight behind it or hold it up to a light, just to make sure that there's no red dot or embryo in there. So washing eggs, there is no requirement for you to specifically wash your eggs. However, there is a requirement that if you're selling to the public, that they are free of manure or debris. So That doesn't mean that you have to wash your eggs, but they have to be free of debris and manure. So don't let your eggs sit in water. Again, because the pores of the eggshell, well, they're porous, so that they absorb, they would absorb through the water, and potentially bacteria that would come in the water from different manure that you would be washing off, right? So you don't want that to be absorbed through. But just take a sponge, or obviously they have egg washers of some kind, but just take a sponge, get rid of the manure and dirt, and that would be fine. So for selling eggs, the only regulation for those who have under 3,000 birds, so I would imagine the majority of you, there is only a requirement for packaging. So you just need to have on the label, what it is. So it would be eggs, right? And then have some kind of contact information. It doesn't have to be all of these, like the name, address, phone number, but it just, you have to be able to, in case somebody gets sick or needs to contact you or anything like that, they need to have a way to do that. So telephone, email, address, whichever one you want. And then the date packaged on there has to be as well. So selling meat, if you are selling to the public, it can be one of three ways. So USDA, you can sell product over state lines, 5A or state inspected. You can sell within the state, and same with the 1,000 bird exemption that you can sell as well. So those are the three ways that that you can process chickens in any of those locations. For selling meat, the regulations for this are where you're getting it processed. So one of those three locations, and it will have an inspected sticker on if it's state or federal. So USDA or 5A, and then even if you're doing it at home, it does have its own certain label on it that lets people know that these were processed under the 1,000 bird exemption. But the packaging regulations for birds are the product name. So if it's chicken wings or whole chicken or feet, whatever it is, the weight, some kind of identifying information, such as your address or telephone number, name, farm name, the handling statement, keep refrigerated, keep frozen, and your ingredient statement in case you have anything that's value added, such as like poultry sausage or marinated poultry of some kind. So but again, as we, when you get to these steps and you have questions, don't think that this is the last time either of us would ever talk to you. We'd be happy to walk you through all the regulations and make sure you're off on the right track. So we wanted to leave time for questions here at the end. I also put our contact information at the bottom, so you can contact us, and what's nice is we all work together. So if one of us doesn't have the exact answer, we can rely on each other. That's the beauty of extension. So I will stop talking and leave it open for questions, or you can type it in the chat, or however you'd like to go about that. But thanks for listening for us today. And I know that was a lot of information, so we will go ahead and get the recording and the PowerPoint to everybody that registered, probably a little later this week.
Thanks so much, Michelle, for that thorough information. We did have a few questions come in on the chat. If you want me to read them off, I think they were in regards to some things you were sharing. The first one from Karen was, what time of year chickens usually molt in New York? you want to take that one, Michelle?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I generally say that they molt, you know, later in the fall or earlier in the spring. However, I have known chickens to molt at all times of the year. So I'm sorry, it's not such a you know, definitive answer, but you know, it depends a lot on light, you know, if they have access to different lights in their barn and things like that. So no good answer for molting from me. I don't know, Grace or Catherine, anybody else? Okay. We have more questions here.
Yeah, we had and these next two maybe some, maybe talk to both of them at the same time, but one person asked, what are the steps for biohazard protection in regards to, I think, avian influenza that you're sharing about, and then someone else was asking about should chickens be vaccinated for anything?
Sure. So biosecurity in general is important for all livestock. Some steps, like I said earlier, would be to make sure that you're keeping the boots that you're wearing on your farm property, and not into other places where other folks can potentially pick that up, you know, off the bottom of your boots, things like that. Having a closed flock or closed herd is important, not having other animals introduced or leave your property without kind of like a quarantine times to make sure that they don't have any diseases coming in or out. Using sanitizer or disinfectant, you know, on your boots, you know, cars even is something that we see, you know, tire wash. I mean, that gets into higher level biosecurity, but, you know, depending if you are, you know, driving your vehicle on your farm property and then driving it on another person's farm property, you know, these are all opportunities to pick up disease. So just being cautious and careful, and knowing that if you're going to somebody else's property, especially that have other birds, clean boots, clean clothes, there and back.
And also if you're like raising meat birds, so you know, once you like process all the birds you have before you bring new ones in, you're going to want to like make sure you clean the space they were living and all the equipment you use. So anything that those birds might have had, you're not passing on to the new ones coming in as well.
Message in regards to what the best procedure is for adding new chickens to the existing ones. So I think Michelle and Grace, you both kind of answered some different parts of that, but just, yeah, quarantining, you know, making sure, going back to what Grace, I think it was Grace shared about, you know, just ordering from a hatchery that you can ask directly about the health status and testing for those things. And then also cleaning out your coop if you're doing kind of all in, all out process that Grace was just describing of, you know, sending them for processing before you bring in new chicks. And then I see Karen asked about sanitizing equipment. Is bleach safe? So I guess it depends which, you know, equipment you would be sanitizing, but I know people use, you know, bleach solutions for boots. Michelle, do you have more to say about that?
Yeah, so bleach is a common disinfectant that's used. Just make sure that you are diluting it based on the label itself. You know, it's not like a 1-to-1. You know, it's like maybe don't quote me, but like a quarter cup per gallon, you know, is all the amount that it needs to have the disinfectant strength. However, and I talk about this because I also talk about food safety for vegetable farms and farming regulations in that sense. And one of my main thing that I like to stress is you can't sanitize a dirty surface. So you have to clean using, you know, a detergent of some kind, or remove all the manure, all the particles and pieces and debris. Just adding bleach to a dirty surface isn't going to disinfect it. You know, that doesn't sanitize that. You have to make sure that you use a detergent, such as some kind of soap, to get rid of the manure, and then you can sanitize the equipment. So that's just an extra step. And there's plenty other disinfectants available for sanitizing. And depending on, you know, if you are doing organic or organic practices, you know, there's a wide range that's out there that you can use. But I will say that always follow the label instructions, please. And I recalled somebody, you're welcome, Karen, mentioned something about vaccinating. No, in general, right? Chickens don't have to be vaccinated. However, something that is common to be vaccinated for is Marek's disease. That's something that is an option. And that's a disease that does affect or can affect chickens less prevalently if you're getting them from a NPIP hatchery, but it is an option to get. So it's always a nice option to have, depending on the amount of chickens you have as well. So if you have more or introducing more at often, you know, different intervals, it's always helpful to get vaccinated chickens. So that's one thing that they won't pass away from. There's all the other stuff, right, that chickens can get, but you know. So again, our emails will be at the end of this, or end of that presentation. So if you do have any questions that you are thinking about after this, or once you go through the presentation again, or as you're getting your poultry ready for the season, you know, go ahead and you can reach out to us anytime.
And you can also find them on our websites too, if you just want to search like CC Orange, Sullivan, or Ulster.
So I'll hang out. I know we ended a little bit early, which is nice because it's still light out, right? And it's just about dinner time. So we will be here for a couple more minutes and we can take any more questions, but I appreciate you guys sticking with us.